Your 23andMe shows 0% Cherokee. Your grandmother says otherwise. 700,000 genetic markers can't recognize what survived removal. The algorithm found something, it just has no language for it. The bar chart populates from the top. European ancestry, broad and confident. Fills the frame. Indigenous American, 0.0%. For millions of people researching native ancestry, that 0 is the moment the mystery begins. Not the answer to a question, but the shape of one. A silence where a number should be. The computer found something it had no language for. This is a cold case, and the evidence was buried before the investigation started. We are going to excavate it, layer by layer, the way archaeologists uncover what was always there. What we find underneath is not a simple error. It is a system that was never designed to see 23,000 years of history. And it has been returning that 0 to millions of people since 2007. Let's start with what we know and work toward what nobody wants to say aloud. In September 2021, scientists published findings in the journal Science that quietly rearranged everything. At White Sands National Park in New Mexico, a series of footprints had been dated to 23,000 years ago. To understand how long ago that is, stack every year of recorded human civilization on top of each other. That stack, from the first Sumerian writing to today, is approximately 5,000 years tall. Now do that 4.5 times. That is how long ago someone walked across a lakebed in what is now New Mexico. The prints show a human gait, stride length, toe shape, the pressure distribution of someone walking with purpose. They were not running. They were going somewhere specific. Someone was already home. That single data point collapsed every migration model that DNA companies had built their reference panels around. Those models assumed human arrival in the Americas closer to 15,000 to 16,000 years ago. The White Sands footprints push that window back by 7,600 years, making the true timeline closer to 23,000 years, not the 16,000 the databases were built on. 7,600 years of human beings living, adapting, drifting genetically in isolation from the rest of the world, generating mutations, accumulating changes, becoming genetically distinct in ways no outside population shared. And none of that 7,600-year window is in any commercial DNA database. The commercial DNA testing industry was built on a deceptively simple premise. Collect DNA from large groups of people, identify patterns, build a reference library. When a customer's DNA arrives, the algorithm compares it against that library and finds the closest match. The match percentage is your ancestry result. Clean, scientific, authoritative. Except, what happens when your ancestors are not in the library? The algorithm does not say missing. It says 0. This is not a bug. It is how the system was built to function. When the algorithm encounters a DNA segment it cannot match to any reference population, it does not display unknown. It reassigns that segment to the nearest statistically acceptable category, or it suppresses it below the reporting threshold entirely. The threshold for most commercial tests sits somewhere between 0.1% and 1%. A great-grandparent from a tribal nation could give you a mathematically real indigenous ancestry percentage. The software rounds it down before you ever see your results. The erasure is automatic. It is silent. And it comes with no asterisk. Think of it this way. A commercial DNA test trying to identify Indigenous American ancestry is working from a flawed map. The cartographer drew Europe carefully, with every street and landmark. They sketched the coasts of Africa and Asia from accounts of travelers who had been there. But the Americas, specifically the interior, the northern nations, the nations that refused to participate, those streets were never drawn. The map is not lying about what it shows. It was simply never designed to show this place. And the streets do not disappear just because the cartographer never visited. 23andMe acknowledged this problem in its own methodology documentation, published in 2015. The Indigenous American Reference Panel, the document confirmed, drew heavily from Mexican and Central American indigenous populations. The hundreds of distinct tribal nations of the continental United States, the Cherokee, the Ojibwe, the Lakota, the Dene, were dramatically underrepresented. meaning a descendant of any of those nations might show 0% not because the ancestry is absent, but because their specific genomic signature was simply not in the comparison library. The company published this admission in a white paper that most customers never read. The results page showed 0. The white paper said, "We may not be able to detect this." Those two messages reached different audiences. Let's build the case file properly, because every good investigation needs its evidence cataloged. Clue 1. The reference panel is geographically wrong. Clue 2. The algorithm erases what it cannot categorize rather than flagging uncertainty. Clue 3. 23,000 years of American genetic history predates every model the databases were built on. But here is what makes this case genuinely strange. Those are not even the deepest layers. We have not yet reached the moratorium, the ghost lineage, or the 90,000 unburied dead. We are just getting started. To understand the deeper mystery, you need to know what the algorithm was actually built from. In 2004, a company called 23andMe was founded in Mountain View, California. The founders were building something new, a consumer product that would translate genetic data into identity narratives. To do that, they needed reference populations, large groups of people whose ancestry was well documented and who had agreed to be compared against. Those volunteers came overwhelmingly from people who had reason to use the product, trust the company, and have internet access. The reference panel reflects who showed up, and who was never asked, or who refused on principle, left a different kind of mark entirely. The Dene, the people most often called the Navajo Nation, are one of the largest indigenous nations in North America. Approximately 400,000 enrolled citizens. To put that in human scale, that is roughly the population of the entire city of Cleveland, Ohio. Sometime in the early 2000s, the Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board formalized what had long been community practice. Outside researchers would not collect Navajo DNA without going through rigorous tribal review. Commercial genetic companies could not access Navajo genetic material. This was not a bureaucratic technicality. It was a sovereign nation making a decision about the most intimate data its citizens possess. 400,000 people, a guaranteed blind spot in every consumer DNA test ever sold. The moratorium did not create the problem, but it illuminates it with perfect clarity, because the Dene decision did not need to be explained to the algorithm. The algorithm simply never received the data, and so it returns 0 for any descendant, not as a deliberate act, but as a mechanical consequence. The result looks the same either way. 0 for a person with no indigenous ancestry. 0 for a descendant of a 400,000-person nation. The number is identical. The meaning is not. And the Dene are not alone in this. The Havasupai tribe, whose ancestral territory sits inside the Grand Canyon, learned what happens when trust is violated. In 2004, tribal members sued Arizona State University. DNA samples collected for diabetes research had been used for unauthorized genetic studies no one consented to. The tribe had given permission for one purpose. The researchers used the samples for another. The lawsuit was settled in 2010, but the damage was architectural. It confirmed for indigenous communities what many already knew from a longer history of exploitation. Outside institutions do not always keep their word. And genetic data, once collected, does not stay where you put it. But what happened inside the databases themselves, what the algorithm does in the dark, that part nobody teaches. When you submit a DNA sample to a commercial testing company, you are participating in a matching game. The algorithm looks at specific locations along your genome, called markers, and compares the variations it finds against the reference panel. For European populations, the reference panel is dense. Millions of data points from Britain, Germany, Scandinavia, the Iberian Peninsula. The algorithm is extraordinarily confident when it finds those patterns. 23andMe detects some European ancestries with accuracy rates above 99%. For Indigenous American populations, the reference library is thin, geographically narrow, and in some cases entirely absent for specific nations. The algorithm's confidence collapses, but the results page does not show a confidence rating. It shows a number that looks as certain as every other number on the screen. There is a technical term for what happens to DNA lineages after thousands of years of relative isolation. It is called population-specific drift. Here is what it means in plain language. Every generation, small, random changes accumulate in a population's DNA. When a population is isolated, not interbreeding with outside groups, those changes compound. After thousands of years in the Americas, many indigenous lineages accumulated mutations that exist nowhere else on Earth. Completely unique genetic signatures, irreproducible anywhere else on the planet. To a commercial algorithm calibrated primarily against Eurasian and African reference populations, those signatures look like noise. Not a match, not a near match, just static. And static gets suppressed. This is what happens inside those servers. Your DNA arrives as a long string of chemical data. The algorithm searches its library for patterns it recognizes, like a trained musician trying to identify a song by its chord structure. It finds European chords. It finds West African chords. It finds East Asian chords. Then it reaches a passage it has never heard before, harmonics that developed over millennia of isolation. The musician cannot name it, so the musician marks it silence. In 2022, a Cell Journal study from the Reich Lab at Harvard identified something important. They found what researchers called a Southern Native American ancestral component and a separate Northern Native American component. These two populations had diverged from each other inside the Americas long ago. They were genetically distinct from one another in documented, measurable ways. 23andMe's algorithm treats all Indigenous American ancestry as a single, undifferentiated reference category. It cannot see this divergence. It cannot detect the difference between a Southern and a Northern lineage. Both vanish equally. Jennifer Raff, a geneticist and author of the 2022 book Origin, documented this complexity carefully. Her research, drawing on peer-reviewed ancient DNA literature, showed the peopling of the Americas involved at least two and possibly more genetically distinct founding migrations. They are not one signal. They are several overlapping signals. Consumer tests collapse all of them into a single poorly defined category and then fail to detect even that. The error is not just about missing data. It is about a fundamental misrepresentation of what Indigenous American ancestry actually is. Now, we go deeper into the archive. Because in 2018, a laboratory in Copenhagen pulled something extraordinary from the frozen record. Eske Willerslev's team at the University of Copenhagen had been studying ancient DNA from burial sites in Alaska. At a site called Upward Sun River, they recovered the remains of an infant, approximately 11,500 years old. The Healy Lake Tribal Council in Alaska gave her a name in their own language, Sunrise Girl Child. She had lain in the Alaskan earth for 11.5 millennia. When Willerslev's team sequenced her genome, they found something that stopped the lab cold. A lineage that had no living match in any reference panel on Earth. The researchers named the population Ancient Beringians. Sunrise Girl Child belonged to a branch of the human family tree that appears to have diverged from other founding American populations very early. Her genome contained ancestral patterns that existed nowhere else, not in any living population sampled by any laboratory. This was not a measurement error. This was a ghost lineage, a population that had existed in the Americas, shaped its landscape, and then disappeared from the genetic record without leaving traceable living descendants in any database, at least none that any current reference panel can identify. The algorithm cannot erase what it was never given, but it also cannot see what time and absence have hidden. Imagine pressing your ear to the ground in New Mexico and listening for a heartbeat that stopped 11,000 years ago. The silence is not proof the heartbeat never happened. It is proof that the instrument was not designed for this frequency. The 2012 research published by Willerslev's lab had already begun unraveling the simple story. Their ancient DNA work showed that the founding population of the Americas split from other Eurasian populations and then underwent a period of profound isolation before entering the hemisphere. A ghost lineage, genetically distinct from everything outside, drifting toward configurations that no outside database had cataloged. This was known in 2012. 23andMe's reference panels were already in use. The science and the product were operating on completely different maps. And then there are the 90,000. Across universities, natural history museums, and federal collections throughout the United States, approximately 90,000 sets of Native American ancestral remains are held in storage. To understand that number, Michigan Stadium, the largest football stadium in the United States, holds approximately 100,000 people at capacity. Fill it almost to the top. Every person in that stadium, unburied, held in a climate-controlled drawer or box with an accession number instead of a name. That is what 90,000 represents. These are ancestors, held in institutions, decades after laws were passed to return them. Many of those remains were accompanied by DNA samples collected in eras before tribal consent protocols existed. The data is documented in research literature. It has not been incorporated into commercial reference panels. This represents simultaneously a profound ethical failure and a scientific one. The ancestry of these individuals, people whose living descendants are actively searching for recognition in their DNA results, sits in an archive that the algorithm never consults. The data exists. The connection is simply not made. Two failures, occupying the same silence. When a segment of your DNA does not match any reference population above the confidence threshold, the algorithm has a choice. It can flag the segment as unresolved, acknowledging uncertainty. Or it can reassign it, finding the closest statistical neighbor and placing it there instead. Most commercial systems choose reassignment. A Cherokee or Lakota descendant's indigenous ancestry segment may be quietly redistributed into a Central Asian or broadly East Asian category, not because those populations share that ancestry, but because they are the statistically nearest available option in the library the algorithm was given. The redistribution happens without notation of any kind. No footnote, no flag, no asterisk. This is the point of no return for anyone trying to understand what the zero really means. The algorithm did not return zero because it looked at your DNA and found nothing indigenous. It returned zero because the segments that carry that ancestry were either below the threshold, reassigned to a different category, or encountered a reference panel that had no data to compare them against. The zero is not an answer. It is a door the algorithm could not open and then reported as empty. And here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore, because this is not just happening to a few people. According to United States Census data, approximately 7.4 million people identify as Native American or Alaska Native. That is roughly the entire population of the state of Washington. The majority of them, if they have taken a commercial DNA test, may have received a result that does not reflect their ancestry at all. Not because they misidentified their ancestry, not because their family knowledge is wrong, but because a system built primarily from volunteers who are not from their communities cannot see them. 7.4 million people, a population the size of a major American state, undetectable to an algorithm sold with the promise of clarity. The Cell 2023 study expanded the ancient American genomic record further. Researchers documented what they described as deeply divergent ancestral lineages within the Americas, populations genetically distinct from any reference group in commercial databases. Their living descendants, people alive today, routinely receive results that show no indigenous ancestry at all. The researchers noted this divergence in a peer-reviewed journal. The product page continued to show zero. There is a term investigators use when evidence points clearly in one direction, but the official record says otherwise. They call it an inconvenient discontinuity. The genomic science says multiple, distinct indigenous lineages, deeply divergent, ancient, real. The algorithm says zero. Both statements occupy the same year, 2023. One is in a peer-reviewed journal. One is on a results page that customers paid $200 to receive. Systems often return precise-looking numbers that mask underlying gaps in data. Zero implies measurement. It implies that the algorithm looked, checked carefully, and found nothing. What it actually means is, we have no reference for this, and we have no way to tell you that. The presentation of certainty is itself the deepest part of the problem. Not intentional fraud, something perhaps more troubling. Structural overconfidence, a system that was never designed to say, I don't know. The wet clay of white sands held those footprints for 23,000 years. The impression of a heel, the curve of an arch, the slight dig of a toe mid-stride. A person walking with weight and intention across a lakebed that no longer exists. That same compressed sediment held the prints against rain, wind, and millennia. The footprint survived. The complete genetic record of who made it was never collected. 23andMe's 2015 white paper acknowledged the reference panel problem in writing. By 2015, the company had approximately 1.5 million customers. The problem was known. The product continued to be sold without meaningful change to how the results page communicated its limitations. A customer opening results in 2021, 6 years after the white paper, received the same zero with the same apparent authority. The science had moved. The product had not moved with it. Let's reconstruct the timeline the way an archaeologist marks layers in a dig. Bottom layer. 23,000 years ago, a person walks across New Mexico. Their genetic lineage begins 7,600 years of isolated development. The databases will never record. Middle layer. 11,500 years ago, a child is born in Alaska. She belongs to a population called ancient Beringians that will leave no clearly detectable descendants in any reference panel. Upper middle layer. 2004. A company is founded in Mountain View, California. They begin building a reference panel from volunteers who are overwhelmingly not indigenous. Recent layer. 2015. The company admits in a methodology document that the panel is inadequate. Surface layer. Today, millions of people receive a zero and do not know what it means. In 2018, the same year Willerslev published the Sunrise Girl-Child Genome, tribal governments across the United States were watching the commercial DNA industry expand with increasing wariness. Not because the science frightened them, but because they had seen this pattern before. Data extracted from indigenous communities, processed by outside institutions, used for purposes the communities never sanctioned. The Havasupai lawsuit was not ancient history, it was 14 years in the past. The pattern of unauthorized use was not theoretical. It was documented. The moratoriums were not paranoia. They were institutional memory. Kim Tallbear, a Dakota scholar and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience and Environment at the University of Alberta, named this tension clearly in her 2013 book, Native American DNA. Her work articulated what the commercial DNA industry had built around a false promise. The promise that genetic ancestry could resolve questions of indigenous identity. Her central argument was an excavation of that promise's foundation. The identity of a tribal citizen, she wrote, does not come from a test tube. It comes from relationships, from responsibilities, from homelands. The science was beginning, just beginning, to catch up to what oral histories had always known. Oral histories are not myths in the dismissive sense. They are data encoded in a different format. The Dene oral tradition speaks of emergence, of a people coming into this world in layers, of identity formed through land and relationship. The Lakota oral tradition carries detailed knowledge of migrations, of movement across the Great Plains, of specific places that shaped specific peoples. These narratives describe, in human and ceremonial language, the same processes of population movement, isolation, and cultural development that the genomic science is now slowly confirming. The algorithm ignores oral tradition because it cannot input stories as reference data. That is not a limitation of the stories. It is a limitation of the algorithm. There is something almost surreal about the year 2021. In September of that year, the White Sands paper was published. Every migration model previously used to calibrate commercial reference panels became technically obsolete. The timeline moved back. The isolation window grew. The genomic complexity increased. That same year, people were logging into 23andMe and receiving 0%. The footprints were 23,000 years old. The database had no reference point for their makers. Both things were true at the same moment. But the most revealing part of this story is still ahead, because in 2024, the archive itself became unstable. We know the algorithm erases what it cannot categorize. We know the reference panel was built without the nations it was supposed to represent. We know the genomic drift of thousands of years made Indigenous American DNA unlike anything the database was designed to find. The question now is not what happened, but what happens next, when the company holding the data may not survive. In 2024, 23andMe entered bankruptcy proceedings. The company held approximately 15 million customer genetic profiles, one of the largest private genetic databases in human history. For most customers, this was a question about privacy and corporate continuity. For tribal governments, it was something else entirely. Because somewhere in that database of 15 million profiles are the results of Indigenous citizens who used the test. Their genetic data, even a result that said 0, carries information about lineage, relationship, geographic origin, and biological relatives. What happens to that data when a company fails? The question has no clean answer in 2025. The legal framework for genetic data in corporate bankruptcy proceedings is undeveloped. A company's genetic database is an asset. Assets are sold in bankruptcy. The Navajo Nation moratorium on outside access to their citizens' DNA means nothing if that DNA was voluntarily submitted and is now part of an asset sale. Tribal governments are actively monitoring this. They do not have a clear, legal remedy. The sovereignty protections that kept the reference panels empty cannot reach back and extract data that individuals already gave away. This is the weight that the 0% result carries forward into the present. The algorithm did not accurately represent Indigenous ancestry, but the data it collected, the 700,000 markers per customer, that data is real. It exists. It is stored. It may be transferred. The failure to accurately represent is paired with the capacity to permanently retain. Two functions of the same system, one visible, one invisible, both consequential. Let us go back to the footprints one final time. The lakebed at White Sands was formed during the last ice age, when higher rainfall created a shallow body of water called Lake Otero. The person who left those prints 23,000 years ago was walking near the edge of that ancient lake. The mud was soft enough to record a footprint, dense enough to preserve it. Across millennia of drying, compacting, and burial, the impression held the shape of a human foot, mid-stride, preserved by chemistry and coincidence. The person who made that print had descendants. Those descendants had descendants. 23,000 years is 115 generations of human beings, give or take. 115 generations of people carrying DNA that accumulated changes unlike anything on any other continent. Some of those people may be alive today, and if they spit in a tube and mailed it to Mountain View, California, the algorithm would look at their genome and find nothing it recognized. 0. Not because nothing is there, but because the library was never built to hold 23,000 years. The Cell 2022 paper noted the northern and southern Native American split. The Cell 2023 paper noted the deeply divergent lineages. The Nature 2018 paper noted the ancient Beringians, a lineage with no identifiable living descendants in any reference panel. Each paper is a dispatch from the same investigation. Each one says, the Americas are more complex than the databases assumed. Each one is published in a journal most customers never read. The results page continues to show 0. There is a specific cold case quality to what the algorithm does with ambiguous evidence. A good detective, faced with evidence that does not fit the existing theory, marks it as anomalous and re-examines the theory. The algorithm does the opposite. It forces the evidence to fit the theory it already has, reassigning the anomaly to the nearest available category. The case is closed before the investigation starts. The filing cabinet is labeled resolved. The anomaly disappears into an administrative decision. The 574 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States represent more distinct sovereign governments than there are countries in the European Union, each with its own history, each with its own language, family, or dialect, each with its own genetic lineage accumulated across millennia of distinct experience. 23andMe's reference panel collapses all of that diversity into a single category called Indigenous American, a category built primarily from populations in Mexico and Central America. 574 nations, one category. Primarily, the wrong geography. The scientific term for this is a reference panel artifact. The human term for it is erasure. Tallbear's words carry a particular weight in the context of this investigation. Writing a decade before the White Sands discovery, she articulated something the archaeology later confirmed. Science is just now beginning to catch up to what oral histories have always known. The footprints were always there, under the lake bed. The genomic divergence was always there, in living cells. The moratoriums were not obstacles to knowledge. They were assertions that some knowledge belongs to the communities who carry it. And the algorithm, for all its 700,000 markers, was built on a library that never asked permission to be incomplete. Here is the final piece of evidence to place in the case file. The 90,000 ancestral remains in museum collections carry DNA data from before consent protocols existed. That data is not in the commercial reference panels. It could, theoretically, help build a more accurate picture of Indigenous American genomic diversity, but incorporating it would require resolving a legal and ethical question of extraordinary complexity. Who owns ancestral DNA collected without consent? Can it be used, even to help living descendants receive accurate results, without the permission of tribal nations? The answer, from the perspective of tribal sovereignty, is clear. No. And so the reference panel stays thin, and the zero persists. Science and ethics meeting at a point of necessary impasse. In 2025, this case remains open. The Dene Nation still governs its own genetic data. The Havasupai still hold the memory of what happens when that trust breaks.